Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into one of history's most glittering, complicated, and surprisingly female-led empires. The Byzantine Empire is usually remembered for emperors. There were emperors with magnificent beards and emperors with terrible judgment. Emperors who started wars they couldn't afford or inherited impossible situations and somehow made them worse. The usual royal hobby list, but tonight we're looking past them, hidden behind gold mosaics and church domes were women who quietly ran one of the most powerful states on earth. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these slow journeys through history. And while you're settling in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket. Turn on a fan if you enjoy that gentle background hum. Let's slowly wander into the marble corridors of Constantinople, a city where emperors wore silk embroidered with gold. Our story begins with a woman who was never supposed to rule anything. Her name was Theodora. Theodora was born around the year 500. What we do know is that she came from a humble background. Her father worked with bears at Constantinople's hippodrome. Yes, actual bears. The stadium was a center of entertainment and politics. When her father died, the family struggled. For women at the lower levels of Byzantine society, options were limited, and so Theodora entered the entertainment world. Byzantine sources describe this period with tremendous, gossipy enthusiasm. At some point, Theodora experienced a remarkable transformation. She became deeply religious and encountered new theological ideas. Eventually, she returned to Constantinople, and there she met a man named Justinian. Justinian was exceptionally ambitious. Justinian fell deeply in love with Theodora, deeply devoted. But respectable aristocrats absolutely hated the idea of an actress becoming empress. But Justinian refused to give up. Laws were adjusted, and eventually the former actress married the future emperor. One of the defining moments of her life arrived during the Nika riots. The city descended into chaos, and buildings burned. Justinian panicked. Many advisors suggested fleeing, and then Theodora spoke, delivering one of history's most famous speeches. She argued that fleeing was unacceptable. The phrase most often associated with her is simple. Royalty is a fine burial shroud. The emperor stayed. The rebellion was crushed. The empire survived. From that point onward, nobody doubted her influence. She advised the emperor, received foreign envoys, and advocated reforms that improved legal protections for women regarding marriage and property. She remained Justinian's closest partner for decades. When Theodora died in 548, Justinian was devastated and never fully recovered. And yet, Theodora's story was only the beginning. Byzantium had a remarkable habit of producing powerful, complicated women. Floating toward us comes another figure, a woman who would blind her own son. And that is where our story will continue. And so we drift forward through the centuries. The empire remains standing, which is honestly impressive. Byzantium spent much of its existence balancing on the political equivalent of a slippery rooftop during a thunderstorm. Yet somehow it kept going. Emperors came and went. Generals rose and fell. Religious arguments multiplied with the speed and enthusiasm of modern internet comment sections. And eventually, around the middle of the 8th century, a young woman named Irene arrived in Constantinople. At first glance, there was nothing particularly unusual about her situation. She was born in Athens, not the mighty classical Athens people usually imagine, not the Athens of philosophers wandering around asking inconvenient questions. This was Byzantine Athens, still important, still respected, but very much living in the shadow of its famous past. Imagine spending every day being compared to your ancestors from 500 years ago. Eventually, Irene caught the attention of the imperial court, specifically Emperor Constantine V, or more accurately, his officials. The emperor needed a suitable bride for his son, Leo, and Irene seemed to fit the requirements. She was noble, respectable, connected to the right circles, and so she was brought to Constantinople. The city itself must have seemed overwhelming. Constantinople was unlike almost anything else in Europe. Gigantic walls surrounded it. Golden churches filled the skyline. Ships crowded the harbors. Merchants arrived from every corner of the known world. It was the sort of place that made visitors immediately understand who held power, and Irene was about to become part of that power. She married Leo. Eventually, Leo became Emperor Leo IV, and Irene became Empress. At this stage, nobody could have predicted exactly how important she would become. Then again, history specializes in surprises. Leo IV was not destined for a particularly long reign. He ruled for only a few years before dying unexpectedly in 780. Suddenly, the empire faced a familiar problem. The emperor was gone. His heir was a child, and somebody needed to govern. That somebody was Irene. Now, technically, she served as regent for her young son, Constantine VI. In practice, Irene quickly demonstrated that she was not interested in being a temporary placeholder. She intended to govern seriously. The Byzantine Empire at this time faced enormous challenges: military threats, religious conflicts, and political rivalries. One of the biggest controversies involved icons, religious images, paintings, and representations of saints. For decades, the empire had been divided over whether these images should be used in worship. People argued. Church leaders argued. Irene supported the restoration of icons. She worked carefully, patiently, methodically, which is usually more effective than screaming. Eventually, she organized a major church council, the Second Council of Nicaea, in 787. The gathering restored official support for icons. This was a major religious turning point, and Irene's fingerprints were all over it. She had influenced one of the most significant decisions of her era. Unfortunately, her son eventually grew up. This created complications, because Constantine VI understandably wanted actual authority. He was emperor after all. Imagine reaching adulthood and discovering your mother had become one of the most powerful people in the world. Tension grew. Court factions formed. Supporters lined up behind both figures. Mother and son drifted toward conflict. Healthy communication was rarely the preferred option in Byzantine royalty. Instead, the rivalry intensified. Power struggles emerged. Constantine attempted to remove his mother's influence, a perfectly understandable decision if your mother effectively controls your empire. The problem was that Irene had spent years building alliances. She understood the bureaucracy. She understood how power actually worked. The struggle continued for years. Sometimes Constantine appeared victorious. Sometimes Irene recovered ground. Back and forth they went. Finally, everything reached its conclusion. In 797, Irene's supporters moved against Constantine. The emperor was arrested, removed from power, and blinded by order of his own mother, which is one of those historical facts that sounds fictional even when it isn't. Constantine disappeared from political life, most likely dying shortly afterward, and Irene became sole ruler, the first woman in Byzantine history to reign alone as emperor. And yes, emperor, not empress consort, not caretaker, emperor. Official documents reflected this remarkable reality. She occupied the throne independently. She issued decrees. She governed the state. Many officials and foreign rulers struggled with the concept. Traditions often struggle when reality refuses to cooperate. In Western Europe, a certain king named Charlemagne was becoming increasingly powerful. The rulers of the West argued that the Roman throne was vacant. Essentially, they claimed a woman could not properly occupy the imperial position. Therefore, the throne was available, conveniently available, for Charlemagne. In 800, Charlemagne was crowned emperor in the West, a moment that would reshape European history. Yet her own position remained fragile. Power in Byzantium rarely stayed secure for long. Loyalty lasted as long as political convenience. In 802, a palace coup removed Irene from power. Just like that, after years of governing an empire, she was overthrown, exiled, and sent away from the city she had dominated. The final chapter of her life was surprisingly quiet. She spent her remaining years in exile, far from the throne, far from the power she had fought so hard to obtain. She died in 803. She left behind a complicated legacy. Some viewed her as a capable stateswoman. Others viewed her as ruthless. Perhaps the truth contains pieces of all those perspectives, because humans are rarely simple, especially powerful humans sitting on golden thrones. And as the years continue, flowing past us like a slow river, another remarkable Byzantine woman waits just ahead. Her name was Theodora. History enjoys recycling names, and she was about to prove that some of Byzantium's most formidable rulers didn't always start with crowns. Sometimes they started with almost nothing at all. And that is where our journey continues. And so, we continue our quiet walk through the centuries. The marble halls of Constantinople are still standing. The palace is still buzzing with rumors. The bureaucrats are still producing paperwork at a pace that would impress even modern governments. And somewhere inside this enormous machine of empire, a young girl named Theodora is beginning a journey that nobody could have predicted. Unlike the first Theodora, this one was not born into the world of entertainers and actors, and unlike Irene, she did not arrive as a carefully selected bride from a respected noble family. In fact, she started with remarkably little. Her father died when she was young. Her family possessed no extraordinary wealth. No famous dynasty stood behind her. No army waited to support her ambitions. At first glance, she seemed destined for an ordinary life. History, however, enjoys ignoring first impressions. By the early 9th century, the Byzantine Empire had already survived enough crises to fill several lifetimes: foreign invasions, religious disputes, civil wars, political conspiracies, court intrigues, occasional bouts of collective panic. And yet the empire continued moving forward, sometimes gracefully, sometimes while tripping over its own feet, but forward nonetheless. Theodora entered the imperial orbit through marriage. The emperor at the time was a man named Theophilos. Now Theophilos was intelligent, educated, energetic, and deeply interested in governing, which sounds admirable, and generally it was. Unfortunately, he was also heavily invested in the ongoing controversy over religious icons. The empire remained divided. Even after Irene's efforts, decades earlier, the question simply refused to disappear. Should sacred images be used? Should they be prohibited? Could people stop arguing about it for 5 minutes? The answer to the last question appeared to be no. Theophilos supported iconoclasm, meaning opposition to religious images. Theodora privately supported the opposite side, which made for an interesting marriage. Imagine sharing breakfast every morning while quietly disagreeing about one of the biggest religious controversies in the empire. a potentially awkward arrangement. Yet by most accounts, their marriage functioned reasonably well, at least by royal standards. Theodora and Theophilos produced several children, including a son named Michael, and for a time, life seemed relatively stable. But stability and Byzantine politics rarely enjoyed long relationships. In 842, Emperor Theophilos died. Suddenly, everything changed. Once again, the empire faced a familiar challenge: a child emperor, a vacant throne, and a woman stepping into power. Michael III was still young, far too young to govern independently. Therefore, Theodora became regent. The pattern was becoming familiar. A boy inherits a crown. A woman inherits responsibility. The difference this time was that Theodora proved exceptionally capable. She assembled a government, managed competing factions, maintained stability, and began addressing one of the empire's most persistent problems: the icon controversy. The argument had lasted generations. Entire careers had been built around it. Entire families had been divided by it. Some people probably forgot why they were arguing and simply continued from habit. Theodora decided enough was enough. In 843, she organized a major reversal of policy. Icons were officially restored. Churches reopened to sacred imagery. The long iconoclastic period effectively ended. The event became known as the Triumph of Orthodoxy, a remarkably optimistic title. Byzantines rarely missed an opportunity for dramatic branding. The decision had enormous consequences. Religious unity improved, political tensions eased, and Theodora's position strengthened considerably. Many church leaders praised her actions. Many ordinary believers celebrated. The empire finally seemed ready to move forward. Of course, governing involved much more than religious policy. There were taxes to collect, borders to defend, officials to supervise, and endless administrative problems demanding attention. Empires generate paperwork the way forests generate leaves. Theodora handled these responsibilities with impressive skill. Foreign relations remained stable. The economy functioned reasonably well. Government institutions continued operating. The empire was not transformed into a utopia. No ruler accomplishes that. But she provided competent leadership during a potentially dangerous transition. As years passed, young Michael III gradually grew older, a development that once again created complications. History appears determined to recycle this particular problem. Children eventually become adults. Adults eventually want power. Regents eventually discover that surrendering authority is less enjoyable than acquiring it. Michael reached adolescence, then adulthood, and naturally began expecting greater control. His mother, meanwhile, had spent years successfully governing an empire. She had advisors, supporters, political influence, experience. None of these are things people casually abandon. Tensions slowly emerged. Not dramatic at first, just small disagreements, small frustrations, small reminders that two people occupied overlapping positions of authority. Over time, those tensions grew. Michael developed close relationships with influential figures at court. One of them was his uncle Bardas. Now Bardas was intelligent, ambitious, and extremely aware of political opportunities. He encouraged Michael to assert himself, to claim authority, to govern independently. The young emperor listened, which was probably inevitable. Most young rulers eventually want to stop being treated like children. The result was a gradual transfer of power. Theodora found her influence shrinking. Not overnight, not through a dramatic confrontation, just steadily, one appointment at a time, one decision at a time, one political shift after another. Eventually, she was removed from active government, not violently, not publicly humiliated, simply pushed aside, a quieter ending than many Byzantine politicians received, which, honestly, counted as a relative success. The empire continued under Michael III. Theodora retired from power, and yet her achievements remained significant. She had governed effectively, ended a major religious conflict, protected the empire during a vulnerable period, and demonstrated once again that Byzantine women could exercise real authority, not symbolic authority, not ceremonial authority, actual political power, the sort that shapes institutions and influences generations. What makes Theodora particularly fascinating is how often she disappears from popular memory. Ask most people about Byzantine rulers, and they might vaguely remember Justinian, perhaps Constantine, possibly a few others. But Theodora the Regent rarely receives equal attention, despite overseeing one of the most important religious settlements in Byzantine history. History can be strangely selective. Sometimes it remembers conquerors. Sometimes it remembers warriors. Sometimes it remembers people who happened to have particularly dramatic mustaches. And sometimes it overlooks highly competent administrators who quietly change the course of events. Theodora belongs firmly in that final category. Her life reminds us that empires are not sustained solely by military victories. They are sustained by governance, administration, patience, compromise, and people willing to manage complicated problems without turning every disagreement into a catastrophe, a lesson many later rulers might have benefited from. As the years drift onward, Constantinople continues glittering beside the waters of the Bosporus. Merchants continue arriving. Priests continue debating. Officials continue plotting. Because no Byzantine story is ever truly finished. And waiting just ahead is another extraordinary woman. One whose rise would be even more improbable. A woman born far from the traditional centers of power. A woman who would navigate one of the empire's most turbulent centuries. A woman who proved that intelligence could sometimes be more dangerous than an army. And as the lamps flicker softly inside the great palace, we begin moving toward her story. Because the women of Byzantium were far from finished, in many ways, they were only getting started. And so, our journey continues. The night is still quiet. The lamps of Constantinople are still glowing softly against marble walls. The sea breeze still drifts through the city. And somewhere inside the great palace, another generation of rulers is preparing to demonstrate family drama. Tonight we arrive at the story of two sisters, Zoe and Theodora. These sisters would become some of the most remarkable women on the imperial throne. They survived one of the most dysfunctional royal families in Byzantine history and still ended up ruling an empire, which is honestly impressive. To understand their story, we need to begin with their father, a man named Constantine VIII, who spent much of his life waiting. His older brother, Basil, was a brilliant military leader who spent decades strengthening the empire. Constantine, meanwhile, mostly existed in the background. Basil died in 1025. After decades of waiting, Constantine finally became emperor at roughly 65 years old. Not exactly a youthful beginning. The problem was that Constantine preferred luxury, banquets, entertainment, comfort. The demanding work of government was somewhat less appealing to him. More importantly, he had no sons, only daughters, and that created a problem. The throne needed an heir, and quickly. Among Constantine's daughters, the most prominent was Zoe. She had spent much of her life inside the palace, which was luxurious but limiting. Imagine spending decades as an imperial princess while watching your opportunities repeatedly postponed. Zoe reached middle age, still unmarried, still waiting. Then, suddenly, everything became urgent. Constantine realized he was dying. The empire required a successor. Fast, so Zoe was married almost immediately to a nobleman named Romanos. Constantine died shortly afterward. Romanos became emperor. Romanos III preferred displaying imperial grandeur. He enjoyed expensive building projects, lavish spending, public appearances, the image of rulership. Unfortunately, images are cheaper than good governance. The empire encountered difficulties. Military setbacks appeared. Financial pressures increased. Romanos eventually died under circumstances that remained suspicious. Very suspicious. Officially, it was an unfortunate event. Unofficially, eyebrows were raised. Within an astonishingly short period, Zoe married again. This new husband was Michael IV. He came from a relatively modest background. Michael suffered from serious health problems. As his health declined, power shifted toward his family, particularly his brother John. Court politics became tangled. Eventually, Michael died. A new emperor emerged, Michael V. He made a serious mistake. He decided to remove Zoe from power. But Zoe was extraordinarily popular. She represented dynastic legitimacy. The citizens of Constantinople erupted in outrage. Crowds filled the streets. Michael V discovered a lesson. When enough people are angry, technical authority becomes less useful. His position collapsed. Zoe returned triumphantly. Now another figure stepped forward, her sister, Theodora. For a brief and remarkable period, both sisters ruled together. Two women sharing imperial authority, the sisters did not always agree. Zoe enjoyed court life and luxury. Theodora tended toward discipline and practical governance. Yet together, they provided stability. Soon, Zoe married her third husband, Emperor Constantine IX. Zoe remained influential. Theodora remained respected. The court remained complicated. Eventually, Zoe died. She had married 3 emperors, survived exile, and ruled an empire. Not bad for someone whose future appeared delayed. When Constantine IX died, Theodora became sole empress, in her own right. By this point, she was already elderly, focusing on governing firmly. When she died in 1056, an era ended. The Macedonian line was coming to an end. Theodora stood at its conclusion, the final guardian. The palace remains full of intrigue. Somewhere beyond the horizon waits another remarkable woman. The Byzantine Empire still has many stories to tell. And so, we arrive at the final stop on tonight's long and sleepy journey through the women who helped steer the Byzantine Empire. The city still stands. The great walls still cast their shadows across Constantinople. The golden domes still catch the morning sunlight. The merchants still argue over prices. The priests still argue over theology. The politicians still argue over absolutely everything. Some things never change. And waiting for us now is perhaps the most unusual woman of all. Not because she ruled as empress, but because she tried something almost as ambitious. She tried to control how history itself would remember her family. Her name was Anna Komnene, and if Byzantine history were a giant library, Anna would be the woman quietly rearranging the shelves after everyone else had gone home. Anna was born in 1083. By this point, the Byzantine Empire had entered a very different age. The empire faced new enemies and new uncertainties, yet it also possessed a remarkably talented ruler, Anna's father, Emperor Alexios Sir Komnenos. From Anna's perspective, her father was almost larger than life, a brilliant leader, a man who inherited an empire in serious trouble. Byzantium, during this period, resembled a ship surviving one storm only to discover three more storms waiting immediately ahead. Anna grew up inside the imperial palace, surrounded by wealth, education, ceremony, and political intrigue. Anna received an extraordinary education. She studied literature, history, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and theology. Anna genuinely was brilliant. She loved learning, reading, discussing ideas, and perhaps most importantly, she loved politics. As a child, Anna occupied an extremely favorable position. For a time, she was effectively considered heir to the empire. Eventually, Anna's younger brother John emerged as the designated successor. This changed everything. The throne would pass to him. Anna admired her father deeply. Her feelings toward her brother were somewhat more complicated. Slowly, those complications grew. Anna married a nobleman named Nikephoros Bryennios. Together, they formed one of the most educated couples in the empire. As the years passed, Emperor Alexios grew older. His health deteriorated. The inevitable succession question approached. When Alexios finally died in 1118, the transition happened quickly. John secured control. Anna suddenly found herself on the losing side. Anna withdrew from active politics. The dream of influencing succession had failed. If she could not shape the future, she would shape the past, and that decision gave us one of the greatest historical works of the Middle Ages, the Alexiad, a massive history written by Anna herself. Anna absolutely adored her father. To say she admired Alexios would be like saying the Mediterranean contains some water. She understood court politics, military campaigns, and diplomacy. As a result, her work preserves invaluable information about the First Crusade. She occasionally viewed Western visitors with the same expression a homeowner might reserve for strangers, tracking mud across a freshly cleaned floor. Through her words, the empire comes alive. The ceremonies, the rivalries, the fears, the ambitions, page after page, year after year. In a strange way, Anna achieved something many rulers never accomplish. She became immortal without ever wearing the imperial crown. People still read her work nearly 1,000 years later. That is a remarkable legacy, far more durable than most palaces, because power fades, empires shrink, dynasties disappear, but stories survive. And Anna understood that better than almost anyone. Again and again, women stood at crucial moments. Theodora saved the throne. Irene ruled as emperor. Anna ensured future generations would remember. And now the lamps of Constantinople begin to dim. The palace corridors grow quieter. The ships settle gently in the harbor. Thank you for joining me. As the city drifts into silence, remember that behind famous emperors stood women who were often just as determined. Napoleon Bonaparte is probably the most famous short guy in world history, which is unfortunate, because he wasn't actually short. This is one of those historical misunderstandings that became so popular, nobody bothered checking whether it was true. A bit like discovering that a rumor started 200 years ago somehow gained its own passport, pension plan, and permanent residence in popular culture. Today, if someone says Napoleon complex, everyone immediately imagines a tiny man angrily stomping around Europe, trying to compensate for his height. The image is everywhere. Cartoons love it, movies use it, comedians enjoy it, school textbooks occasionally hint at it, the internet practically adopted it as a pet. The only problem is that the real Napoleon was not unusually short at all. In fact, for a man living in late 18th century France, he was actually considered fairly average, and possibly even slightly above average, depending on which measurements historians use, which raises a very reasonable question. If Napoleon wasn't short, then why does almost everyone think he was? Well, like many great historical misunderstandings, it involves confusing measurements, political propaganda, national rivalries, artistic choices, and humanity's remarkable ability to repeat things without checking them. So let's slowly wander back to Corsica. The year is 1769. Napoleon Bonaparte enters the world just months after the island becomes part of France. The timing is important. Corsica had spent years resisting foreign control. National identities were complicated. Political loyalties were complicated. Everything was complicated, which, as we will discover, was a recurring theme throughout Napoleon's entire life. His family belonged to the lower ranks of the local nobility, not desperately poor, not enormously wealthy, just wealthy enough to possess social ambitions and financial worries at exactly the same time, a surprisingly common aristocratic condition. Young Napoleon grew up speaking Corsican and Italian before fully mastering French. When he eventually attended military school in mainland France, he stood out. His accent sounded different. His background seemed unusual. His personality was intense, and he had the social skills of a man who considered mathematics more trustworthy than people. Not exactly a recipe for effortless popularity. Classmates sometimes mocked him. Teachers occasionally found him difficult. Napoleon responded in the mature and balanced way he would later apply to international politics. He became determined to prove everyone wrong. As a student, he immersed himself in reading. History fascinated him. Military strategy fascinated him. Ancient Rome fascinated him. Alexander the Great fascinated him. Basically, if a dead conqueror had marched an army somewhere, Napoleon probably wanted to read about it. While other young men might spend evenings socializing, Napoleon often spent hours studying. He read obsessively, thought obsessively, planned obsessively. There was already something unusual about him. Not physically, mentally. He seemed convinced that destiny had reserved something extraordinary for him. History generally discourages that kind of confidence. Napoleon somehow made it work. The French Revolution erupted when he was still a young officer. Suddenly, old political structures collapsed. Ancient institutions crumbled. Power shifted constantly. Careers rose and fell overnight. For ambitious individuals, it was both terrifying and full of opportunity. Napoleon proved exceptionally good at navigating chaos, which sounds useful because it absolutely was. Military victories arrived. Promotions followed. Political influence expanded. By his late 20s, he had become one of the most celebrated generals in Europe, and at this point, nobody was talking about his height. Nobody. His enemies complained about many things: his ambition, his military genius, his growing influence, his ability to win battles, his tendency to completely overturn carefully arranged political plans. But height was not the issue, because there was nothing remarkable about it. The confusion would emerge later, much later, and it would begin with numbers. Numbers have an unfair reputation for being reliable. Most of the time they are, until somebody measures one thing using one system, and another person interprets it using a completely different system. Then chaos quietly enters the room. When Napoleon died in 1821 on the island of St. Helena, doctors recorded his height. The figure most often cited was 5 feet 2 inches. That sounds tiny. Modern readers immediately imagine someone dramatically below average. Case closed. Mystery solved. Except those weren't English feet and inches. They were French feet and inches. A completely different measurement system. And this is where generations of confusion begin. French units were larger than British units. When historians convert the measurement properly, Napoleon comes out somewhere around 5 feet 6 or 5 feet 7 inches in modern measurements. Not gigantic, not towering, but certainly not unusually short. In fact, for a European man born in the 18th century, that height was perfectly respectable. Many historians consider it average or slightly above average for his era. Suddenly, the famous image starts looking much less convincing. The supposedly tiny emperor was actually standing at a height that would barely attract notice. Yet the myth survived. Why? Because measurements alone weren't responsible. The British helped. Quite a lot, actually. Britain spent years fighting Napoleon. Years. Entire generations grew up during the conflict. The wars reshaped Europe. Governments feared him. Military commanders studied him. Newspapers discussed him constantly. When you spend that much time fighting someone, insulting them becomes a national hobby. British cartoonists absolutely loved attacking Napoleon. They portrayed him as ridiculous. They portrayed him as arrogant. They portrayed him as absurdly small. Sometimes they practically reduced him to the size of a decorative garden ornament. Political cartoons are not famous for fairness. They are famous for exaggeration. And exaggeration sold newspapers. A giant emperor might seem intimidating. A tiny emperor seemed ridiculous. Ridicule can be a powerful weapon, especially when facing an opponent whose battlefield record was frankly becoming inconvenient. So artists repeatedly drew Napoleon as miniature. Readers laughed. The images spread. The stereotype strengthened. And before long, millions of people encountered caricatures instead of reality. Interestingly, Napoleon himself occasionally contributed to the confusion. Not intentionally, just indirectly. His imperial guard contained exceptionally tall soldiers. These men were enormous by contemporary standards. Selection requirements favored impressive height. The purpose was obvious. If you want an elite military unit guarding the emperor, choosing giant soldiers creates a memorable visual effect. Standing beside them, almost anyone would appear shorter, including Napoleon. Imagine placing an average-sized man between several basketball players. The average-sized man suddenly looks tiny, not because he changed, because the comparison changed. Napoleon frequently appeared in exactly that situation. Observers noticed. Artists noticed. The myth gained another layer. Then there was his nickname, Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal. Modern readers encounter this title and assume it referred to physical height. Reasonable assumption. Completely wrong. The nickname reflected affection. Soldiers used it to emphasize closeness and camaraderie. It suggested familiarity, respect, shared experience. It had nothing to do with stature. But once later, generations encountered both the nickname and the measurement confusion. They connected dots that were never connected originally. Human beings are extremely talented at creating patterns. Sometimes the patterns are real. Sometimes they're historical accidents, wearing a convincing disguise. Meanwhile, Napoleon continued building one of the most extraordinary careers in history. He became first consul, then emperor. He reorganized government, reformed legal systems, restructured education, changed administration, influenced institutions that still exist today. For someone supposedly compensating for shortness, he spent an impressive amount of time rewriting Europe. Of course, none of this meant he lacked confidence issues. Napoleon possessed insecurities, just like everyone else. He worried about reputation, He worried about loyalty. He worried about political threats. He worried about military risks. The difference was that most people process anxiety by losing sleep. Napoleon processed anxiety by reorganizing continents, which admittedly created additional paperwork. His personal presence also surprised many visitors. People expecting a fiery monster often encountered someone calm and controlled. Observers repeatedly commented on his charisma, his ability to command attention, his remarkable memory, his intense concentration, his confidence. Very few memoirs focus heavily on unusual shortness because there wasn't much to discuss. Instead, people remembered the force of his personality. And personality can dramatically affect how someone appears. A confident person often seems larger than life. Napoleon excelled at that effect. When he entered a room, people noticed. When he spoke, people listened. When he issued instructions, governments moved. Physical measurements only tell part of a story. Presence tells another. Napoleon possessed enormous presence. Perhaps that is why the irony feels so remarkable. One of history's most influential leaders became permanently associated with a characteristic he didn't actually have. Ever wonder why everyone thinks Napoleon was tiny? It's not because it was true, but because the story was just so simple. And let's be real, simple stories spread like crazy, right? Explaining messy stuff like French measurements or British propaganda takes way too much time. A quick joke about a short emperor? That fits perfectly in one sentence. Honestly, reality is complicated, but myths are just easier to believe. Turns out, he was actually totally average-sized. Crazy, right? Did you know the most famous thing about Napoleon is actually a total lie? It's wild how we got his height so wrong, right? If we missed something that basic, what else are we totally missing? Honestly, the real Napoleon was way more complex and fascinating than that weird cartoon version we've all seen. He's absolutely incredible. Imagine conquering half the world on just a couple hours of sleep. Napoleon was basically a machine, and honestly, his energy was kind of terrifying. He treated sleep like some annoying notification he just wanted to swipe away. You know? The guy could pass out instantly, wake up suddenly, and get straight back to work for hours like nothing happened. It's absolutely wild. His poor secretaries and generals were literally running on fumes, just trying to keep up with him. He was outworking entire governments, while they were probably just desperate for a nap, right? Napoleon really believed there weren't enough hours in the day, right? He tried to squeeze every second out of life. As he dominated Europe, his routine was absolutely wild. A non-stop flood of letters, reports, and data hit his desk daily. Guess people always loved complaining to the government, you know? Imagine having a boss who remembers every tiny detail and grills you at 2 a.m. That was Napoleon. He obsessed over every report and caught every single mistake. If he asked a question, you needed a perfect answer immediately. It made him incredibly effective. But man, it sounds totally exhausting. Can you imagine him bringing up some random detail from 6 months ago? It's absolutely wild, right? Imagine working for Napoleon. It was a total roller coaster, right? Most officials barely survived because his brain was on another level. People were actually spooked by how much he remembered. Names, dates, military stats. It was like he had a filing cabinet shoved inside his head. He didn't just shout orders. He obsessed over logistics. I know, it sounds incredibly boring, but things get real fast when an army runs out of food. Napoleon totally understood that. He knew his soldiers couldn't win on empty stomachs. Truly mind-blowing, isn't it? Imagine trying to win a war when your soldiers and horses are totally starving. Without solid logistics, even the smartest plans are just expensive hikes, right? While most people obsess over big battles, Napoleon was actually losing sleep over boring stuff like roads and food. It's not glamorous, but it's absolutely vital. Of course, winning all the time definitely helped his reputation. It honestly seemed like every time an alliance popped up against France, Napoleon just saw it as a personal invite to redraw the map again. There he goes again, redrawing borders and leaving everyone in the dust. Napoleon's secret weapon was pure speed. He moved so fast that enemies were still debating while he was already winning. It's absolutely wild how much confusion that creates, right? But don't let those legendary victories fool you. Behind every effortless win was a guy totally obsessed with every tiny detail. We love to think it was easy, but it was actually just massive, intense preparation. Crazy, isn't it? Geniuses like Napoleon operate on a totally different level, right? But here's the catch. Winning all the time actually messed things up. Everyone started treating him like he was completely unstoppable. And honestly, he believed it too. Confidence is awesome, but getting way too cocky is just dangerous. He felt invincible, but he was definitely pushing his luck. You know, imagine a guy who basically owned all of Europe, right? Napoleon's power and fame were absolutely blowing up. Kings were constantly sweating over his next move, trying to guess what he'd do next. But he always kept them guessing. What's really wild is that even as emperor, he didn't act like your typical, stuffy royal. While other kings were all about fancy rules and keeping their distance, Napoleon was different. Sure, he loved a good ceremony and some sharp uniforms, but he stayed surprisingly simple and practical. It's pretty crazy, right? He totally obsessed over every tiny detail. Honestly, he was just an ambitious manager who somehow became emperor, right? Armies included. Napoleon was obsessed with redrawing maps, right? People expected some fancy royal, but they got a guy who actually worked for his power. European elites were absolutely terrified because he wasn't just born into it, he built it himself. That's a massive deal in a world of snobby dynasties. Then things got really wild when he started handing out crowns like candy. Suddenly, his brothers were kings, and his sisters were royalty, living in palaces their ancestors couldn't even imagine. It sounds like a total fairy tale, but it actually caused huge drama because family stays family, even with a crown on. Some did okay, but others? What a mess. Imagine being the person who pushes Napoleon's buttons. Seriously, the man had zero patience, but he kept hiring his family anyway because he thought it was safer than trusting strangers, right? Huge mistake. History proves both options can really blow up in your face. It's honestly such a mess. Napoleon found out the hard way that a good story beats the truth every single time. Everyone thinks he was this tiny emperor, right? This little guy commanding massive armies. It's a total myth. People loved the contrast because it felt so satisfying. Writers and enemies absolutely obsessed over it. Not because it was true, but because it was such a catchy story. Honestly, his actual height didn't matter. People were way more blown away by his insane energy and brilliant mind. That's what really made him a legend. But here's the catch. The more you win, the harder it gets to see your own limits. You know, every big win makes you want to take an even crazier risk, right? It's like you start thinking, the rules don't even apply to you anymore. Napoleon was totally stuck in that headspace, and honestly, He had no idea how dangerous it was about to get. Everyone thinks he was short, but he really wasn't. He was just this super intense guy who barely slept and felt like he could do absolutely anything. But you know what? That's usually exactly when things start to go wrong. His biggest enemy wasn't some massive army from Britain or Russia. It was something way more personal. He really believed that winning once meant he'd always win. That's exactly where things get really messy. The strange thing about Napoleon's life is that the further he climbed, the less anyone seemed interested in seeing him as an ordinary human being. Supporters transformed him into a hero. Enemies transformed him into a villain. Artists transformed him into a symbol. Politicians transformed him into a threat. And somewhere in the middle stood an actual person trying to manage an empire that stretched across enormous portions of Europe. The real Napoleon often disappeared beneath the stories people preferred to tell about him. By the early 19th century, his reputation had become almost mythical. Across Europe, people spoke about him with fascination, fear, admiration, resentment, or some combination of all four. Parents mentioned him. Soldiers discussed him. Diplomats worried about him. Journalists wrote about him endlessly. Few individuals in history have occupied so much mental space for so many people at the same time. He became less of a man and more of a phenomenon. Ironically, the myth of his shortness grew strongest precisely when his power reached extraordinary heights. The contrast appealed to human imagination. A supposedly tiny man dominating kings and emperors felt like a perfect story. People love unexpected combinations. They enjoy the idea that physical appearance can be misleading. The image of a small emperor commanding vast armies practically wrote itself. Accuracy, unfortunately, never received an invitation to this particular storytelling session. The reality remained stubbornly ordinary. Modern estimates generally place Napoleon somewhere around 5 feet 6 or 5 feet 7 inches in modern measurements. Depending on the region and period, that was either average or slightly above average for a Frenchman of his era. Nobody meeting him on a street would have stopped and thought, "Good heavens, what an unusually small man." They would have noticed his uniform, his confidence, his intense stare, and his remarkable presence long before they thought about height. Presence is one of those difficult qualities historians struggle to measure. We can measure height. We can measure weight. We can measure distances and dates. Presence is different, yet countless eyewitnesses commented on it. Napoleon possessed an ability to dominate attention. When he entered a room, people noticed. When he spoke, listeners focused. Even critics acknowledged the effect. He had the kind of personality that made physical measurements seem less important. Many visitors described his eyes. That detail appears repeatedly in memoirs. Some spoke of their intensity. Others mentioned how observant he seemed. People often felt as though he noticed everything. Whether this was entirely true hardly mattered. The perception itself became part of his power. Leaders frequently influence events not only through reality, but through what others believe about them. Of course, not everyone admired him. Plenty of people considered him dangerous. Plenty considered him reckless. Plenty considered him ambitious beyond reason. And to be fair, they had evidence. Napoleon had an unusual habit of defeating armies, toppling governments, and redesigning political systems. Such behavior tends to attract attention. It also tends to create enemies. As years passed, however, the confidence that fueled his rise gradually evolved into something riskier. Success can be addictive. Every victory reinforces belief. Every achievement encourages larger ambitions. Napoleon had spent so many years proving doubters wrong that he sometimes struggled to recognize situations where doubt might actually be useful. History is filled with brilliant people who eventually became convinced that brilliance exempted them from limitations. The campaign against Russia in 1812 became one of the clearest examples. Napoleon assembled an enormous force. Plans were made, preparations were completed, expectations were high. Yet reality refused to cooperate. Distances stretched endlessly. Supplies became difficult. Weather became hostile. Circumstances deteriorated. The campaign transformed from a demonstration of power into a lesson about the dangers of excessive confidence. Europe watched carefully. Rivals sensed opportunity. Governments that had spent years adapting to Napoleon suddenly realized he might not be invincible after all. The image of the unstoppable emperor began developing cracks, and once cracks appear in political myths, they rarely remain small for long. The following years brought defeats, coalitions, negotiations, and uncertainty. Napoleon continued displaying remarkable resilience. Even when circumstances worsened, he remained active. He remained determined. He remained convinced that recovery was possible. In many ways, this stubborn refusal to surrender had always been one of his defining characteristics. It had helped create his success. Now it helped prolong his struggle. Eventually, he was forced into exile. For many historical figures, exile marks the quiet conclusion of a public career. Napoleon approached it somewhat differently. He escaped, returned to France, reclaimed power, and briefly resumed control in one of history's most astonishing political comebacks. Because of course he did. An ordinary ending apparently did not suit him. Then came Waterloo. One battle, one defeat, one event destined to occupy history books for centuries. Yet even Waterloo did not erase his influence. Political systems changed. Governments changed. Borders changed. Napoleon's impact remained. The legal reforms he introduced continued shaping societies. Administrative changes endured. Institutions survived. Defeat ended his rule. But it did not erase his legacy. His final years unfolded on St. Helena, a remote island in the Atlantic Ocean. There, far from the capitals he once dominated, Napoleon spent time reflecting on his life. Visitors came, conversations occurred, memories were recorded. The former emperor increasingly became a historical figure, even while still alive. It is a strange transition. Few people experience it. Napoleon certainly did. When he died in 1821, his story did not end. In some ways, it accelerated. Historians analyzed him. Politicians referenced him. Writers interpreted him. Artists depicted him. Generations argued about him. Some saw a genius. Others saw a tyrant. Many saw both simultaneously. Very few historical figures inspire such persistent debate, and somewhere during all this discussion, the height myth continued marching forward. School children learned it. Cartoonists repeated it. Popular culture embraced it. The misunderstanding became so widespread that millions of people accepted it without question. A measurement error, combined with propaganda and repetition, gradually transformed into accepted wisdom. The story serves as a useful reminder that historical myths often survive because they are convenient rather than accurate. They simplify complicated lives into memorable images. Napoleon becomes the short emperor. Marie Antoinette becomes the queen, who supposedly said things she never said. History repeatedly gets compressed into neat little stories that fit comfortably inside popular memory. Yet reality is usually more interesting. The real Napoleon does not need imaginary shortness to become fascinating. He was already fascinating. a Corsican outsider who became emperor of the French, a military commander whose campaigns reshaped continents, a reformer whose legal code influenced nations around the world, a man capable of extraordinary brilliance and extraordinary mistakes. Perhaps that is why historians continue returning to him, not because he was perfect, not because he was monstrous, but because he was profoundly human, ambitious, intelligent, energetic, flawed, determined, contradictory, the same qualities that make history worth studying in the first place. And when we finally return to the original question, was Napoleon actually considered tall for his time? The answer turns out to be surprisingly simple. Yes, he was likely average to slightly above average by the standards of late 18th century France. Certainly not unusually short. Certainly not the tiny figure popular imagination created. The famous stereotype simply does not survive contact with the evidence. So, the next time someone mentions Napoleon's height, remember that one of history's most famous facts isn't really a fact at all. The emperor who supposedly conquered Europe to compensate for being short was never especially short in the first place. The joke lasted 2 centuries. The records tell a different story. And now, as our journey through Napoleonic France finally drifts to a close, the campfires fade beyond the horizon, the armies march into memory, the imperial banners disappear into the evening mist, the maps stop changing for a moment, the arguments of politicians, generals, kings, and emperors gradually grow quiet, leaving behind a curious lesson from history. Sometimes, the truth is not hidden inside great battles or dramatic revolutions. Sometimes, it is hiding inside a simple measurement that millions of people misunderstood. And somehow that small misunderstanding became one of the most famous legends in the modern world. So tonight, as Europe settles into silence and the emperor finally takes his place among the pages of history, you can rest knowing that Napoleon Bonaparte conquered much of the continent, reshaped the modern world, terrified governments, inspired generations, and achieved lasting fame. And through all of it, he wasn't actually short. The Black Death usually enters history books like a sudden storm that simply shows up, destroys everything, and leaves without much explanation, as if Europe had offended the universe in some deeply personal way and was now being ignored on purpose. It is often described as a disaster, a plague, a collapse, a moment where civilization paused and quietly said, "Well, that's unfortunate," before continuing in a slightly more haunted version of itself. But the reality, as always with medieval history, is a bit messier, slower, and far more human than the dramatic textbook version suggests. And that is exactly where our story begins, drifting in from the edges of time. To understand the Black Death properly, we don't start with rats or ships or cities or even Europe itself. We start much earlier, in a world where trade routes were already stretching like invisible threads across continents, quietly connecting places that did not think of themselves as connected at all. Silk, spices, ideas, and occasionally diseases all traveled along these routes, and nobody at the time was really keeping track of what else might be coming along for the ride. Because, well, optimism tends to be historically loud and medically unhelpful. By the early 14th century, the world was already a tightly woven network of exchange, even if people didn't describe it that way. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Constantinople were not just wealthy centers. They were intersections of human movement, where merchants arrived with goods, sailors arrived with stories, and sometimes things arrived that nobody had ordered. Of course, nobody in these cities thought of themselves as part of a global system. They were just trying to survive taxes, weather, and the occasional political meltdown, which already felt like a full-time job. Somewhere far to the east, in regions often vaguely labeled in European chronicles as the East, outbreaks of disease were already circulating through populations. Modern historians associate early outbreaks with Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried by fleas that lived on rodents. But at the time, nobody had microscopes, germ theory, or even a consistent idea that invisible things could be responsible for mass suffering. Medieval explanations leaned more toward divine displeasure, corrupted air, or general cosmic irritation, which, to be fair, was emotionally satisfying even if medically unhelpful. As trade expanded, so did contact between regions. And with contact came the unintentional movement of biological agents. Ships leaving ports were not just carrying silk and ceramics. They were also carrying rats. And those rats were carrying fleas. And those fleas were carrying something that would eventually become one of the most infamous biological events in human history. But at this stage, everything was still hidden inside ordinary movement, like a story that hasn't realized it is a tragedy yet. When the disease finally reached the Mediterranean basin around the mid-14th century, it did so quietly at first. Ports did not immediately collapse. Markets did not instantly empty. People did not suddenly understand they were living through a turning point in human history. Instead, things just began to feel slightly off in certain places, like a song played a little out of tune, noticeable, but not yet alarming enough to stop everything. The first major wave into Europe is often traced to the Black Sea region, particularly trade cities connected to Mongol-controlled territories. One frequently cited but semi-legendary account describes the siege of Kaffa, where disease allegedly spread among besieging armies and then into the city itself. Whether every detail of that story is perfectly accurate is still debated, but what matters is the pattern it represents. War, trade, and movement creating unexpected biological consequences, all happening long before anyone understood what biological consequences even meant. From these points of contact, the disease spread along maritime routes into Italy, and from there into the rest of Europe. Ships arriving in ports like Genoa and Venice became silent carriers of something nobody could see. By the time people began noticing consistent patterns of illness, the spread was already well underway. This is one of the recurring themes of the Black Death. By the time you realize what is happening, it has usually already been happening for a while. Medieval cities were especially vulnerable because they were dense, crowded, and not particularly interested in sanitation in any modern sense. Streets were narrow, animals were common, waste management was, let's say, informal, and living conditions meant that humans, animals, and everything in between shared space very closely. From the perspective of disease transmission, this was less an environment and more an open invitation. As the plague spread, it did not behave like a slow, predictable illness that moved politely from house to house. It moved in waves, clusters, and bursts, affecting some areas heavily while sparing others temporarily, which made it even more confusing for people trying to understand what was going on. Without scientific frameworks, people interpreted these patterns through superstition, religion, and fear, which is understandable because randomness is very difficult to emotionally process without a narrative attached to it. One of the most striking aspects of the Black Death is not just its mortality rate, but the psychological impact it created. People did not just see death statistically, they experienced it socially, repeatedly, and in extremely close proximity. Families were affected together. Neighborhoods changed rapidly, and entire communities experienced the kind of disruption that made normal life feel increasingly unreliable. Medical understanding at the time varied widely, but most explanations revolved around the theory of humors, imbalanced bodily fluids, or corrupted air known as miasma. Physicians often wore distinctive masks filled with herbs, believing that scented materials could protect them from poisonous air. From a modern perspective, this looks symbolic rather than effective, but within their worldview, it represented a logical attempt to control something that otherwise seemed invisible and uncontrollable. Religious interpretations also became central. Many people viewed the plague as divine punishment or moral correction, which led to a range of responses from repentance and prayer to more extreme social behaviors. In some places, this even contributed to scapegoating and social tension as communities searched for human explanations to assign responsibility to something that was ultimately biological and impersonal. At the same time, not all responses were purely fearful or religious. Some cities attempted practical measures, such as isolation of the sick, restrictions on movement, and attempts at quarantine, especially in port cities like Ragusa and Venice. These early public health measures were not perfect, but they represent one of the first large-scale attempts in Europe to systematically respond to disease through policy rather than purely superstition. Despite these efforts, the disease continued spreading across regions, moving through Italy, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and eventually reaching England and beyond. Each region experienced it differently, depending on population density, trade connections, and timing, but the overall pattern remained consistent: rapid spread, high mortality, and profound social disruption. What makes the Black Death particularly difficult to summarize is that it was not a single event, but a sequence of outbreaks over time, with the most devastating wave occurring between 1347 and 1351, followed by recurring epidemics in later decades. In other words, it was not a moment in history so much as a long shadow cast over multiple generations. As entire communities were affected, economic structures began to shift in unexpected ways. Labor shortages emerged, traditional hierarchies were strained, and social mobility in some areas increased because so many positions were suddenly left vacant. This is one of those historical paradoxes where catastrophe unintentionally reshapes society in ways that no one planned, and nobody at the time would have described as progress, even if long-term effects eventually looked that way. Cities that had once been densely packed began to feel emptier. Villages changed character. Workforces became unstable. Land use patterns shifted, and slowly, almost without anyone intending it, the structure of medieval European society began to adjust in response to demographic collapse. Yet, through all of this, one of the most important realities remained. People continued trying to live normal lives. Markets reopened when possible. Governments issued orders. Religious institutions adapted rituals. Families rebuilt themselves where they could. Human behavior, even under extreme pressure, tends to move toward continuity rather than total collapse, which is one of the quieter and more consistent patterns in history. As we reach the end of this first part, the Black Death is no longer just an abstract disaster moving across maps. It is becoming something more grounded, more social, and more connected to everyday medieval life. The disease is not simply arriving in Europe. It is moving through a world already full of trade, belief, politics, and routine, and it is about to reshape all of them in ways that will take generations to fully understand. And as we drift forward into the next part, The question becomes not just how the plague spread, but how people actually lived through it, reacted to it, and slowly began to change the world in response to something they could not see, could not fully explain, and could not simply ignore. The strange thing about the Black Death is that it never really arrived with a clear announcement, no matter how dramatic later storytelling makes it sound. For most people living through it, there was no single moment where the world clearly broke. Instead, life just started behaving slightly differently, in a way that was easy to dismiss at first, like bad weather that refuses to leave, or a rumor that keeps changing shape every time it is repeated. In many towns, the earliest signs were subtle. A few unexplained deaths here, a strange fever there, families falling ill in clusters, which was unsettling but not immediately interpreted as a continental crisis. After all, medieval life already included a fair amount of sickness, and people were used to uncertainty being part of the background noise of existence. The human mind has a strong tendency to normalize what it sees often enough, even when what it sees is alarming. So when illness began appearing more frequently, it was often absorbed into existing explanations. Seasonal imbalance, bad air, divine displeasure, anything that preserved the sense that the world was still fundamentally understandable. But underneath that normalcy, something was shifting at a scale nobody could see. The disease did not respect social boundaries, which was especially disturbing in a world that was built on those boundaries. Nobles, merchants, clergy, laborers, all could be affected, even though the impact often felt uneven, depending on living conditions and proximity to trade routes. In wealthy households, there was sometimes an early assumption that wealth provided protection, better food, cleaner surroundings, more distance from crowded streets. But that illusion did not last long in many places. The disease moved through networks of human contact that wealth could not fully insulate against, especially in cities where everyone still relied on shared infrastructure and constant interaction. As mortality increased, so did confusion. People tried to identify patterns that would make the situation feel less random. Why this family and not that one? Why this street and not the next? Why this week and not the previous one? Without scientific understanding, these questions often led to interpretations that focused on moral or spiritual causes, because randomness was simply too uncomfortable to accept. Religious institutions became central in explaining and responding to the crisis. Churches filled with prayers, processions, and rituals meant to seek protection or forgiveness. In many regions, there was a noticeable intensification of public religiosity as communities tried to negotiate with a force they believed might still be influenced by behavior, repentance, or collective action. At the same time, fear did not always express itself in orderly or unified ways. In some places, it led to solidarity. In others, it led to suspicion. When people cannot clearly identify the source of suffering, they often begin looking closer at each other, searching for hidden explanations in human behavior rather than accepting an invisible cause. This is where social tensions sometimes emerged. Marginalized groups were occasionally blamed for the spread of disease, as communities sought simple explanations that could be acted upon. It is a recurring pattern in human history. When invisible problems become too large to understand, visible targets often become convenient substitutes. Meanwhile, the practical realities of daily life began to change in increasingly noticeable ways. Workplaces became unstable as laborers fell ill or did not return. Trade slowed in some areas due to fear and disruption. Local economies struggled to maintain normal rhythms. Even basic routines like burial practices became overwhelming in heavily affected regions. Burial itself became a major challenge in cities. Cemeteries filled faster than expected. Traditional rituals became difficult to maintain at scale. In some places, mass graves were used out of necessity, not as a choice but as a response to circumstances that exceeded normal capacity. These developments contributed further to the psychological weight of the period, as familiar cultural practices were forced to adapt quickly. Yet, even in the midst of disruption, people continued trying to preserve structure. Municipal authorities issued regulations. Religious leaders provided guidance. Households adjusted their behavior. Quarantine practices began to emerge in certain port cities, where officials attempted to control movement in and out of affected areas. These early forms of public health policy were inconsistent, but they represent an important moment in administrative adaptation. The idea of quarantine, for example, developed in part through observation that isolation sometimes reduced spread. Ships arriving in Venice were required to wait for extended periods before unloading. This was not based on germ theory, which did not exist yet, but on empirical observation that separation sometimes made outbreaks less severe. It was a practical response, emerging from necessity rather than theory. At the same time, communication across regions became increasingly important and increasingly unreliable. News of outbreaks traveled along trade routes, often arriving too late or in exaggerated forms. Reports were shaped by fear, misunderstanding, and incomplete information, which meant that governments and communities were often reacting to partial pictures of a much larger situation. One of the most important, but often overlooked aspects of this period is how unevenly the plague affected different regions. Some towns were devastated, others experienced far lower mortality. Some areas saw repeated waves over time, others recovered more quickly. Geography, trade connections, population density, and timing all played roles in shaping outcomes, creating a patchwork of devastation rather than a uniform collapse. In rural areas, the impact could look different from urban centers. Villages sometimes experienced high mortality due to close-knit living conditions, but they also sometimes had more isolation from major trade routes. The experience of the Black Death was not a single uniform reality, but a series of overlapping local crises that together formed a much larger historical transformation. As mortality continued, psychological responses became more complex. People struggled not only with grief, but with uncertainty about the future. In a world where survival had previously been tied to known patterns of risk, the sudden unpredictability of death created a sense of instability that extended beyond immediate health concerns. This uncertainty influenced behavior in subtle ways. Some people withdrew from public life. Others intensified participation in communal rituals. Some focused on preserving family stability. Others made drastic decisions about property, inheritance, or religious devotion. Society did not respond in a single unified way, but through many individual reactions layered on top of each other. Governments, too, faced challenges that went beyond public health. Labor shortages began to affect agriculture and production. Fields could go unworked. Goods could go unproduced. Economic systems that relied on predictable labor availability began to strain. In response, authorities sometimes attempted to regulate wages or control movement of workers, which added another layer of tension to already fragile systems. At the same time, there were also unintended consequences that would later reshape European society. With fewer workers available, labor gained relative value in some regions. This shifted long-term economic relationships between landowners and workers, gradually contributing to changes in feudal structures. These changes were not immediate revolutions, but slow adjustments triggered by demographic shock. Through all of this, one of the most consistent features of human behavior remained visible: adaptation. Even in the face of widespread disruption, people adjusted their expectations, modified their routines, and attempted to restore continuity wherever possible. Life did not stop. It reorganized itself under pressure. As this second part comes to a close, the Black Death is no longer just a moving wave across maps. It is becoming a lived experience, something felt in households, markets, churches, and streets. It is shaping not only mortality, but behavior, not only population, but perception, and not only cities, but the underlying structure of medieval life itself. And as we move forward, the focus shifts from how societies responded to the crisis toward what long-term transformations quietly began forming underneath it, changes that would outlast the plague itself and reshape Europe in ways that nobody living through it could fully recognize at the time. By the time the worst waves of the Black Death began to fade in many regions, Europe did not feel like it had returned to normal, mostly because nobody could agree on what normal even meant anymore. The population had changed. The workforce had changed. Entire families had disappeared from certain towns, and in some places, whole streets felt permanently quieter, like the world had simply lowered its volume without warning. But life, as it always does in history, did not stop. It adjusted, slowly, unevenly, and often in ways that nobody planned or fully understood. One of the first major long-term effects was demographic imbalance. There were fewer people, but the land had not disappeared. The farms still existed. The fields still needed work. The cities still needed labor. This created a strange situation where, for a period of time, human labor became more valuable in many regions than it had been before. Not because society suddenly became more generous, but because basic arithmetic had changed. Landowners, who were used to abundant labor, suddenly found themselves negotiating with workers in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Workers who previously had limited mobility or bargaining power began to find themselves in higher demand. This did not instantly destroy old systems, but it did begin to bend them. Feudal structures, which had depended heavily on stable populations and clearly defined obligations, started to experience pressure. When there are fewer people to perform the same amount of work, those people gain leverage, even if nobody explicitly announces that fact. Over time, this contributed to shifts in economic relationships that would slowly reshape European society. In some regions, authorities tried to resist this change. Laws were introduced attempting to control wages or restrict movement of laborers. These efforts reflected an attempt to preserve older systems rather than adapt to new realities. But enforcement was uneven, and the underlying demographic reality often proved stronger than legislation written in response to it. At the same time, land use began to shift in subtle ways. With fewer workers available, some agricultural land was abandoned or repurposed. In certain areas, production patterns changed, sometimes moving toward less labor-intensive activities. These changes were not coordinated reforms. They were practical responses to absence. Urban centers also began to evolve. Cities that had lost significant portions of their population slowly restructured themselves. Some neighborhoods remained partially empty for years. Others were gradually repopulated through migration from rural areas. The rhythm of urban life changed, not abruptly, but in a lingering, uneven way. Religious life, which had intensified during the height of the crisis, also underwent transformation. The emotional urgency of mass fear and grief gradually gave way to reflection. People who had lived through repeated waves of mortality often developed different perspectives on life, death, and authority. Some became more devout. Others became more skeptical. Many simply carried both tendencies at once, depending on circumstance. Art and cultural expression also began to reflect the experience of widespread mortality, although not always directly. Themes of death, memory, and transience became more common in various forms of medieval expression. This was not always explicit commentary on the plague, but the shadow of the experience lingered in the cultural imagination. One of the most important long-term consequences of the Black Death was institutional adaptation. Governments, churches, and cities had been forced to respond to crisis conditions without preparation. In doing so, they developed new administrative habits, quarantine systems, record-keeping improvements, and public health measures in some regions became more formalized over time, even if still imperfect by modern standards. Trade networks, though disrupted, did not disappear. Instead, they adjusted. Routes shifted. Ports changed in importance. Commercial activity continued, but with altered patterns shaped by both population loss and recovery cycles. Economic life proved resilient, even when dramatically reorganized. It is also important to note that the Black Death did not end in a single moment. It returned in waves over the following decades and centuries. Different regions experienced recurring outbreaks at different times, meaning that the psychological memory of plague remained present for a very long time. It was not a single historical event that people remembered, but a recurring possibility that shaped how they thought about risk. This recurring nature meant that European societies developed a kind of long-term awareness of epidemic disease, even without understanding its biological causes. People learned patterns of avoidance, response, and recovery. These patterns were imperfect, but they were real forms of adaptation within the limits of available knowledge. Over time, the combination of demographic change, economic pressure, and institutional adaptation contributed to gradual transformations in European society. These changes did not occur overnight, and they were not uniform across all regions, but they collectively influenced the transition from medieval structures toward early modern systems in parts of Europe. It would be a mistake to describe the Black Death as the sole cause of these changes. History rarely works that cleanly, but it would also be a mistake to ignore its role as a major accelerating force. It exposed weaknesses, it reshaped populations, it forced adaptation, and it created conditions where older systems had to evolve or adjust. Perhaps the most important lesson from this period is not about disease alone, but about how societies respond to large-scale disruption. The Black Death revealed how quickly assumptions can collapse when underlying conditions change, and how slowly institutions adapt even when reality has already shifted beneath them. It also revealed something more constant: human persistence. Even in the face of overwhelming mortality, people continued to farm, trade, worship, govern, and rebuild. They continued forming families. They continued making decisions about the future, even when the present felt unstable. Life, in other words, did not pause. It recalibrated. As we reach the end of this journey, the Black Death is no longer just a historical catastrophe moving through time. It has become something more complex, a force that reshaped demographics, economies, institutions, and perceptions across an entire continent. not in a single dramatic moment, but through a long process of adjustment and survival. And so, as the centuries move forward and Europe slowly rebuilds itself in the aftermath of unimaginable loss, the silence left behind by the plague is not empty. It is filled with new structures forming, new relationships emerging, and new systems quietly taking shape in the space that was once occupied by the old world. The world did not end in the 14th century, but it did change, and it never quite became the same again.